Hello, and welcome back to The Land, a Borderland basketball podcast. I'm your host, Javier Cortez, and this is episode 3. So, it's been a minute since the last episode. That was not intentional or on purpose in any way. I was having some technical difficulties that I think I've sorted out for good, hopefully, going forward. That delayed this episode and future episodes planned for this month coming out. To say the least, the technical and production sides of producing a podcast is not really my forte, but I'm learning, I'm improving, and I think I'm eventually getting to a point where each episode will be quality, not only in terms of the content, but hopefully the production value as well. So I do apologize for the delay, but hopefully from here going forward, we get back to a weekly publishing of episodes. And I still think it's going to be a good month of episodes that I have in store. Before I get into today's episode, I just want to talk about a few things going on within basketball in the Borderland. First thing, I want to just call people's attention to the latest story that I wrote on my Substack. I use the term latest very relatively because I wrote this story at the beginning of the month. It's an opinion piece on why I think Kayla Thornton should get her jersey retired by the UTEP women's basketball team. Not a hot take. I think anybody who knows anything about Kayla Thornton knows that she's more than deserving of that. She's undoubtedly the greatest player in the women's basketball program's history. She holds essentially every major statistical record one can hold, and she played on and led undoubtedly the best teams that the women's program has ever had in the mid-2010s. I had the privilege of getting to watch Kayla play in high school as well as covering her in college. We both went to Irvine High School. She was a few years ahead of me, but I watched her play a lot during her junior and senior year, and then getting to cover her during that really special run for UTEP women's basketball, like I said, in the mid-2010s. So undoubtedly she's deserving. It's certainly past due. But in an update to the story that I wrote, Keitha Adams replied to my story and said that they are currently working with Kayla on finding a date where they can get the ceremony. So hopefully this season we see Kayla get her jersey retired. And it seems like those things are in motion with what Coach Adams indicated. So it's great. That being said, I still think the story is a worthwhile read, especially if you don't know Kayla too well in terms of just her dominance at UTEP, starting back at Irvine High School, and how she's extended her professional career to a decade now. And she plays on one of the best teams in the WNBA that is on the precipice of winning a world title. So I think it would be a great culmination for Kayla and the New York Liberty to win the WNBA championship, and then for her to come home and get her jersey retired as she rightfully deserves. In other news, one of the top 2025 prospects just signed with a college. As these episodes go on, I'm going to try to spend some time talking about the top 2025s who are getting offered, committing, signing to programs. So for this week, Austin Bonilla, a senior point guard from Canutillo High School, one of the best pure point guards the Borderland has to offer, signed with Northern New Mexico College in Española, New Mexico. They are a NAIA school. Shout out to Austin Bonilla. He absolutely deserves it, can play at the next level, and I'm glad he's getting an opportunity to do so. And I believe he's one of the first, if not the first, 2025 prospect to sign to a college program for this upcoming basketball season. So a little earlier than expected for when you see prospects sign. But, you know, again, congratulations to Bonilla, the Bonilla family, the Canutillo program, because he's an absolutely excellent player who still has a great senior year ahead of him. So congratulations to Austin and everybody associated with him and the Canateo boys basketball program. Now, for today's episode, this is a bit of a different episode, being that what I have planned for today is not really part of the typical content I'm trying to produce on this podcast. That being, I'm doing an episode on issues within the basketball community in the borderland, more specifically as it's tied to El Paso. When I was coming up with this podcast, the intended goals in terms of the type of content I was trying to produce hasn't changed. Even with this episode, it's still to give coverage to deserving prospects who deserve more coverage, and to hopefully down the road have on some guests, and secondly is to amplify voices within the basketball community who I think deserve a bigger platform as well. And I think this episode is somewhat going to do the latter, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is informed by a lot of in-depth conversations I've had with really informative, knowledgeable figureheads within the basketball community here in El Paso. But it is different, because within talking about something like community issues, it brings on a negative connotation. But I want to spend a little bit of time explaining how I came to this episode. So, as I've talked about in previous episodes, when I'm not at games or watching game tape, I try to meet with as many different people as I can who are knowledgeable about the basketball scene here in El Paso and Las Cruces, and just try to get a much more broader perspective of some of these prospects, talking to people who have a much longer viewing history with these prospects and have been around in the local high school basketball scene significantly longer than I have. And within these, at this point, over the last year and a half, close to 36 in-depth one-on-one conversations that I had with various people, coaches, trainers, strength and conditioning coaches, scouts. Within these conversations, these meetups that are ostensibly about players, prospects, we always invariably end up talking about issues within the community, things that are hindering player development or holding players back from maximizing their full potential and their possible opportunities at the next level. These side conversations invariably just happen unprompted for the most part. And what I've found interesting and common within essentially all these conversations is that when I'm talking to these people, they're all talking about the same issues, more or less. Maybe they're phrasing it or framing these issues slightly different, but more or less, a lot of the same opinions about what's not going right in this city about basketball is pretty consistent, regardless of who I talk to, whether they run in the same circles or not. And as it continued to happen, I started to feel compelled to maybe voice these opinions and these thoughts, and try to do it in a tactful, clear, cogent way that is substantive and productive for an episode. And really with an emphasis on it being substantive and productive, because again, like I said, bringing up issues comes with a negative connotation, and I am going to be talking about negative things, but I also want to do my best to punctuate some of these issues with some level of positivity, not for the sake of just being optimistic, but because I think some of these issues, most of these issues, have some level of solvability to them. I think there are solvable outcomes. I think some of these issues are a lot more deeply rooted within our culture and our city politics that makes that solvability a lot more complex. But even so, I think even offering a different perspective on how to look at these issues can be productive. So this isn't going to be an episode where I am calling out people specifically by name and criticizing people. I'm not going to do that. Again, I don't think that's very productive or worthwhile. But my critiques and my criticisms and the alternatives that I'm offering are more or less going to be centered around the collective choices that are being made within our basketball community and our larger El Paso community. Because ultimately, one, I think to have some type of change or solvable outcomes, it's going to come from a collective shift in perspective and choice making from our community, but also it's not really about criticizing people's individual choices, because really at the heart of this, I don't think that a lot of what I'm going to talk about is bad people with bad intentions making bad decisions. I think a lot of what I'm going to speak about today is a lot of well-intentioned people making decisions that they feel works best for them, their kid, their players, their programs, their teams. And that's very understandable. But within that, when everybody is essentially has this individualistic mentality about the choices that they make in terms of how we do basketball here, you have a lot of people looking out for themselves and not looking at the consequences of how that impacts the larger basketball community and just in general our local society altogether. So the critiques are going to be around the collective choices, not about calling out individuals. I'm not going to do that. I will be talking about politics to a degree on this episode, but not politics in the sense of left versus right, Democrats versus Republicans, nothing like that. I know some people get turned off when they hear political talk getting mixed with sports talk, and I understand that, but my response to that is when we're talking about sports at the prep level, sports that are deeply embedded into local communities, and for communities to function, they need governance. And to govern, you need politics. Politics are not inherently good or bad. Politics are made up by the actions and choices by the people that inhabit that community. So if we can understand that we need politics to govern and we need governance for a community to function, and sports are a integral staple of a community, then we can understand that sports and politics are deeply intermixed and interconnected with each other, whether we like it or not. It's just a fact. And that goes for all levels, not just at a city level, state level, a national level, a collegiate level, at a pro level too. It's all intermixed, whether we want to acknowledge that. So there will be some political talk, but again, not in, I think, the way that gets framed politically at a national level. We're not doing that on today's episode. So I ask you that, you just lend me your ear and I'll do my best to make clear connections with what I'm talking about. I'm going to do it through mixing in some storytelling, some anecdotes, giving examples of where I think these issues are playing out in very clear ways. At times, I'm going to be zooming out and talking very broadly, but I'm going to do my best to bring it back to how it's affecting basketball in this area. And hopefully it makes sense. So we'll see. And again, these are my opinions and mine only. I like to think that it's based on well-informed coverage and well-informed conversations that I've had with people who are also well-informed and very knowledgeable. It's also based off my year and a half of covering high school basketball in this area, my experience as a sports journalist here, dating back to the early to mid 2010s, and also my perspective as a born and raised El Pasoan who's lived here for 3 decades. So all of that is going to help contextualize what I'm talking about here today. So without further ado, let's get into it. So let's start with a very basic point of fact statement acknowledgement about basketball in the borderland. As it currently stands in the borderland region, which I'm defining as El Paso to Las Cruces, everywhere else in between, and Alamogordo, there is currently only one Division I prospect on the boys' side and one Division I prospect on the girls' side. On the boys' side, it's Jaden Leverett from Chapin High School. He's a senior center. And on the girls' side, it's Allison Della O from Franklin High School. She's a freshman point guard. Now, if you talk to anybody who is well-versed in the talent level here in the borderland, specifically El Paso, people who know the prospects really well, know what it takes to play at the highest levels, the D1 level, everybody you will talk to will unanimously say that those numbers are not indicative or representative of the actual talent level that we have here. We have more than two combined on the boys and girls side D1 prospects. Now, some of those people might squabble over what that exact number is, but everybody can agree that those numbers are not representative of what's going on here in terms of the talent level. And it begs a very simple question. If everybody can agree on that, the most knowledgeable people that played at a D1 level can agree on that fact, why is that? What's causing that, essentially? Why? And I think to get into what we're talking about today, we can start with a very basic overlaying issue. There is an outside perception issue about the talent level here, specifically in El Paso, being that El Paso is not a talent-rich city, nor is the borderland a talent-rich area. And that's a sentiment I've heard going back to, again, even when I was covering UTEP athletics a decade ago. You hear stuff like that. A general sentiment can be said like this, essentially. Why would a coach from Central or East Texas drive 8 to 10, 12 hours out of their way to come to El Paso when they can just go to Dallas or Houston? Why would coaches from the West Coast, if they're going to come to the Southwest, come all the way to El Paso when they can just go to Phoenix? And part of that sentiment is true in the sense that Dallas, Houston, Phoenix has an immense amount of talent, bigger cities than El Paso. There's no denying that. But the other part of that sentiment that El Paso is not worth coming to, or it doesn't have talent, is where, again, a lot of people who are in the know about basketball in this area would strongly disagree. And so what the bulk of today's episode is going to be about is how the internal issues that are going on within our community are perpetuating this external perception that there isn't talent here. There are certainly coaches who from outside El Paso who are in the know about the talent level, but not a lot of coaches coming from top programs at the D1 level, or really, quite frankly, any coaches at the D1 level, at least in abundance. And the ones that do come, they're not necessarily always here to see more than one or two players, unfortunately. So I'm going to talk about these internal issues that are perpetuating these long-held sentiments about a place like El Paso. So let's start with, I think, the first issue, and honestly the most complex issue that I'm going to talk about today, that I think doesn't have an immediate solution. And I think part of the solution that's going to have to be taken on is a perspective shift in how we vote, consume, and support things in El Paso. So again, when I'm having these conversations with really knowledgeable people about basketball in this area, and we get onto the topic of issues, and I ask, what are some of the biggest issues plaguing basketball in this area? The first thing that most people say is that the borderland El Paso has too many high schools. Last time I counted, and you can fact check me, I might be off by a few, but El Paso and Las Cruces combined, and everywhere in between, Santa Teresa, Chaparral, there are 40 high schools, public, private, and charter. 40. That is a lot, to say the least. So with too many schools, the obvious ramification of that is it spreads our talent too thinly across this region, across this area, across this city. And what that kind of results in is when El Paso schools play out of their district, or when they try to get out of our region, we really struggle to do that, let alone to really make any hay within the state playoffs. And that's kind of true for just about every sport here, with the exception of a few. But for the most part, El Paso schools historically struggle beyond district and regional play because of that talent dispersion spread so wide and so thinly. Now, one might say, well, it's not just that. It's we have to compete with Dallas and Houston that are like twice our size or 3 times our size, and they have, way more talent, which is true. But also, those cities are a lot more densely populated, and they don't have that talent spread the same way that we do. So they're not really plagued necessarily by the same issues that we are in terms of having such a large amount of options for where players and just kids can go to school in this area, in this city. Additionally, being that there are 40 schools in El Paso and Las Cruces combined, public, private, and charter, it puts a stress on having well-tenured, CV'd, resumed coaches to lead programs at the varsity, junior varsity, and freshman level. More importantly, to have coaches who are going to be effort-filled and caring in what they do with their student athletes. Now, I want to be very clear what I'm saying here. I am not saying that El Paso does not have talent. We absolutely do have talent. And I'm not saying that El Paso doesn't have well-qualified coaches. We do. What I'm saying is, with the demand of having 40 schools, we do not have the supply to meet that demand in terms of filling out robustly talented rosters and well-qualified, tenured coaches who, again, care about what they're doing and are effort-filled in that. And I want to hone in a little bit more on the coaching side of this. I have the perspective on this because my dad led a high school tennis program, 2 high school tennis programs for more than a decade. The majority of time at Irvin High School and at Franklin High School. I was the son of a coach. So anybody who's the son of a coach, son of a teacher, when they wake up and go to work, you go with them. Same with my dad. So for tournaments, setting things up, doing all the necessary things to run a program, I saw those things firsthand. And what I saw with that is that not every other coach at other programs is willing to put in the work, the sacrifice, really the service and the free labor that it takes to run programs competently and with care. That's just a fact. And it's not just a basketball thing, it's in every sport. And when you have 40 schools, which everybody agrees that it's too much for this area, this city, invariably you have to fill these positions, whether you're putting people who are in these positions that are qualified or not. These are positions that must be filled for these programs to run. And quite frankly, you don't always have, again, well-resumed, tenured, CV'd coaches for those positions. And to go with that, sometimes, let's say you do have a coach that has a good resume, but do they care? Do they put in the work and the effort with their kids, or vice versa? Maybe you have somebody who does care and does try really hard, but they're not necessarily qualified. So that is an issue when you don't have enough supply to meet that demand. And again, I'm not trying to denigrate the landscape of coaching here in El Paso. I'm just saying, with the abundance of schools, all those programs are not competently filled with greatly qualified people, if we're going to just be very honest about this. And again, especially when you're talking about 40 high school programs on the boys side, 40 high school programs on the girls side, but then a varsity program leader with the coaching staff, a JV coach and a coaching staff, a freshman coach and a coaching staff. And I understand the freshman coaches and the JV coaches are part of the larger program staff, but you still have to have people at every single level that we have for prep sports at the high school level. And we're not even getting into middle school, which is important within the developmental stages with really talented prospects. So with all that, one of the natural responses, or kind of what I would call quick solutions, that a lot of people offer, and I think even a lot of really intelligent people offer, is that, well, you got to close schools down. There's some schools that should just be closed. Close this school over there, close this school over here, take these kids, put them here, take those kids, put them there. And I can understand the general logic of that, but also I can understand how in some cases, for some schools, that seems like an eventuality, an inevitability. I can understand that. But I think upon deeper examination, I don't really think it's a very good solution. Number one, because it doesn't really solve the problem. But what it does is it displaces kids who probably can't afford to be displaced. But deeper than that, I think it sends the wrong message about this bigger issue that we're having within El Paso right now. And I think one of the biggest issues that is plaguing El Paso right now is this thing called urban sprawl. For those who don't know, urban sprawl is essentially continuous and rapid expansion of a city that spreads out of the center of the city, which has a lot of unintended consequences, like increased infrastructure costs, increased use on private transportation, and a diminishing on public transportation, low density residential housing, and a myriad of other really bad consequential things that come out of it. In specific, what I'm talking about is the rampant eastward expansion that we're witnessing in the city. If you've lived in El Paso for more than a decade, then you're well aware of how fast Far East El Paso is growing. And if you've lived here for more than a decade, like myself, you can remember when places like Eastlake and Horizon were minuscule, very small, not highly populated. I was out in Eastlake a month and a half ago, and I was stunned by how quickly developed it is and how populated it is, and really just all of Far East El Paso like that. And I think anybody who has to commute to Far East El Paso, lives in Far East El Paso, or finds themselves around there, the traffic is horrendous. And not only just on 375 or I-10, it's not just the freeways and highways, it's the side streets, it's basically everywhere. And within this, in some ways, poorly planned expansion to further east, it's created a lot of issues, again, like infrastructure costs, like traffic issues, that play a role in what's going on with, again, this idea that I think is correct, that we have too many high schools. Now, again, I do not think that the good solution here is to simply close schools down. And I want to give an example of why I think this kind of unconscious collective move to Far East El Paso and this unconscious voting, consuming, and supporting that is going on within our community has really bad and unintended consequences. And I want to tell a story. So my mother, aunt, and uncle all went to Irvin High School in the early 1980s. I believe they graduated in 1980, 81, and 82, respectively. My uncle in particular played for the football team back in Irvin's heyday under the legendary coach Tony Shaw. And when my uncle would come back into town, he would tell stories about the glory days, and he would talk about Irvin's biggest rivals of the time. And of course, chief among them, Andrews High School, the Northeast rival right down the street, Austin High School out in central El Paso, and then to my surprise as a young teenage boy, Coronado High School from the west side. And he would talk about Coronado as Irvin's biggest rival among all those rivals, Coronado being the biggest. They would come over the mountain to our side of town. We'd go over the mountain to their side of town. Big crosstown rivalry, Northeast and West side. Fast forward close to 3 decades after my uncle was graduated, and I'm in high school now. I'm not a football player. I'm a tennis player, as I already said. And if you know anything about tennis, it's an expensive sport, and it's not very popular in Northeast El Paso, where I grew up. So naturally, my brother and I, who played tennis with me, to play against the best competition and to get the best practice and development, naturally, you have to go to West El Paso. West El Paso has all the country clubs, the CHOP facilities, junior development programs. And we're very fortunate enough to get into country clubs and to some of these top junior development programs because my dad had the right connections and he knew the right people, but certainly not because we could afford the country club fees. We were not country club members. It was simply just about the connections that we had, and we were very fortunate for that. And within these junior development programs and these country clubs, they're largely made up of West Side kids, obviously. You would have some kids from El Paso High, a few East El Paso High School kids sprinkled in, some very wealthy kids coming from Juarez, some private school kids from Loretto and Cathedral, a lot of kids from Franklin, and a lot of kids from Coronado. For those who don't know, the Coronado boys and girls tennis team is the best tennis program in the borderland, bar none, and it's been that way for as long as I've known. They do better than any other program in individual and team competition. They go farther in the state playoffs, team and individual, than anybody else in this region. They put more kids into college programs. They're the best team. And they're the type of kids who largely inhabit these country clubs and junior development programs. So my brother and I, being from Northeast El Paso and being of a different skin color, we were much darker than everybody else. I used to be a lot darker than I am now. We stood out. We looked differently than everybody else. We talked differently. We acted differently. We played differently. We dressed differently. All of those things, we stood out amongst others. So naturally, a lot of our peers would ask us, where are you from? I've never seen you before. I've never heard of you. Who are you? And where'd you go to high school? And we would respond and say, we go to Irvin High School. And oftentimes the response to that would be something in verbatim or akin to, where's Irvin High School? I've never heard of that. What's Irvin? Fast forward to present date. It's been more than a decade since I've graduated. Irvin doesn't have a tennis team anymore. It's completely gone. So on the off chance that maybe a kid from Northeast El Paso wants to be a tennis player and they so happen to go to Irvin High School, they're not going to have that opportunity. Moreover, they're not going to know about any history of Irvin's tennis program and somebody like me who played there. And I don't say this to toot my own horn, but I was a decent player. I was a 4-year varsity player, 3-year all district, 3-year all city, two-time regional qualifier. I was district champion my senior year. I accomplished decent things for a high school tennis player in this area, but that history is essentially gone and not something that, again, a kid from Northeast El Paso who might go to Irvin would know or think is possible to even do for a kid from that area of town. Part of the reason why that legacy, that history of Irvin High School diminished over time was because in the early 2000s, there was this idea or belief, how substantive or true it was, that there was going to be a huge population boom in Northeast El Paso. There's going to be an influx of military families and military people coming in to Northeast El Paso. Therefore, there was plans of making another high school in Northeast El Paso, even though Northeast El Paso already had Parkland, Andrus, and Irvin in close proximity with each other. The exact location of where that fourth high school was going to be placed changed over time, but it eventually became Chapin High School. What essentially happened over these past 20 years, that military population boom never really came, partly because it kind of just expanded eastward. And what the unintended consequences of that became were that Chapin essentially drained resources from a school like Irvin, drained our athletic talent, drained our academic talent, and a lot of that was put into that school. Now, this I don't bring Chapin up to put them down in any way. It's really not about them. What this is about is, in some ways, unconscious support, consumption, and voting on things that we don't need if we deeply and critically think about these things. Northeast El Paso never needed a fourth high school, and it's had a severe negative effect on a school like Irvin High School. Now, you might be asking, why are you bringing this up specifically? Why should we care about Irvin High School? I don't care about Irvin High School. I didn't go there. I don't live in the Northeast. What is this relevant? What does this have to do with basketball issues? I bring this up because, in connection with how rapidly we're expanding and moving out to Far East El Paso and moving out of the city center, we are abandoning established communities with tradition, history, culture, and diversity like Northeast El Paso. And again, I think we're doing it more so in an unconscious way with not understanding the ramifications for it, which is why I'm not criticizing people's individual choices. If you found your dream house out in Eastlake and you're sending your kids to that high school for them to start their, own history and tradition and create memories, and you like the education that's being provided, I mean, Godspeed, good for you. And I truly mean that with zero condescension. I'm not patronizing as I say that. I mean that. But we need to be more conscious about this rapid expansion, because another issue within this is that when you look at other major cities within the United States, New York, Los Angeles, Seattle, St. Louis, Dallas, Houston, so on and so forth, and you go to these cities, a lot of these cities, and you go around to different parts of the city, different communities, their west side, their east side, their northeast, their downtown, their central. When you go into those different parts of those cities, they're distinctly different and unique from each other. The architecture is different. The businesses, the commerce is different. The cultures are different. The food, all of it is unique in of itself. And in El Paso, which is, in my opinion, one of the most unique cities major cities within this country because we share a culture, community, economy with another country, which is something that most other major cities in this country can't say. We have a beautifully unique, rich Mexican American culture here. But when you go around El Paso, outside of the wealth infrastructured, gridlocked west side and the historic districts of downtown and south central El Paso, which are slowly being revitalized, rejuvenated, but let's call a spade, gentrified, there's a sameness, there's a hegemonic quality to this city where you could be really anywhere around town and it looks all the same. It's the same commerce, it's the same retail, it's the same fast food restaurants, it's the same convenient shopping, the same businesses that essentially inhabit and take over all of these spaces. Again, I was in Eastlake a month and a half ago, and outside of the newness of it all, it's the same things. It's the same McDonald's, the same Starbucks, the same Taco Bell, the same convenient retail shopping. All of it's the same. And I think we have to start asking more deep and critical questions. What's the point of all this? Why are we moving away from the city center for things that, outside of them being new, are things that we already have? Furthermore, why are we moving away from the city center, creating infrastructure issues, putting a much deeper stress on private transportation for things that don't really represent our culture? Because that's the other thing about this city. Again, really outside of the historic districts, fast food restaurants don't represent this very unique borderland culture. Same as the convenient shopping, or really any of the kind of corporatist commerce that we have here. And in addition to that, ultimately, what a lot of these businesses are serving are a very small, finite amount of people, some of which don't actually even live here. A lot of these strip malls that are created and built all over town are made by the same few land developers who buy up this land at a cheap cost and build the same type of shopping centers with the same type of fast food restaurants that are corporately owned. Yes, there might be local store owners, but ultimately, I mean, McDonald's is not a local business. Starbucks is not a local business. Taco Bell is not a local business. And what it really represents is this corporatist stranglehold on a lower class socioeconomic strata. But again, it doesn't really represent our culture and it doesn't really benefit our people. So if you find yourself out in Eastlake, Horizon, Far East El Paso, look around and try to see how much of it is genuinely unique and how much of it is land that is bought up by the same land developers to produce the same national chains of food and retail commerce. So again, it brings me back to, we have to think more critically, more consciously, and with more consideration about the things we vote for, the things we consume, and the things that we support. Because Northeast El Paso has been abandoned and divested in for the most part. And part of that has to do with the rapid expansion, but the misinformation and negative stereotyping about what this side of town is actually like. Because the people who actually live here and raise families here have a lot of positives to say about it. But yet the perception from people who don't live in El Paso is to think otherwise. And that's another part of this that we're going to get to. But getting back to this solution of closing schools, and what I hear a lot about Irvin, and the quick solution is, and even by smart people that I have a lot of respect for and listen to, their best solution is to close a school like Irvin. And again, they can be thinking from the perspective of the inevitability or the eventuality of that fate for maybe a school like Irvin. But what I think it sends in terms of a message is that people's history, tradition, and culture ultimately is not as important for things that are new, and new things that are not really culturally embedded and representative or unique, but just new. Because again, if you go to Far East El Paso, you're more or less just going to find new things that we already have, but we don't really need, nor does it represent our culture or really support us or benefit us. It benefits, again, a very finite amount of people, some of which don't even actually live here. So that's something that has to change, or at the very least, I think we need a perspective shift on these things, because this is not a easy solution or thing to fix. But if we keep having the mentality that we can move out of spaces, out of neighborhoods, out of communities for newer things, and abandoning and divesting in areas, then we're liable to keep making that mistake, which will keep exacerbating this issue, bringing it back to basketball, of having too many high schools. Therefore, too many high school programs that aren't talent rich, that do not have well qualified, tenured CV coaches who care and are effort filled. So again, to the people who don't live in Northeast El Paso and don't necessarily care about Northeast El Paso, I'll end this issue on this. One day, East Lake High School will be Irvin High School, and there will be a Chapin High School opening up next door to you. And you'll wonder, why do we need this? What's the point of this? And then you'll understand what it feels like to lose tradition, history, and culture when it happens to you, because it will happen if we keep this same unconscious mentality of voting, supporting, and consuming things that we do not need. So just a perspective that I'm offering on that. Again, it's a very complex issue. It's bigger and deeper than basketball. It's not solvable overnight, but I do think we need a perspective shift on what's going on in this city with urban sprawl and with the rapid expansion of Far East El Paso. It's not a good thing. I'm sorry. It's just not. Okay, moving on. I'm going to talk about the Chapin boys basketball program. And I'm going to talk about them at length, really, here. And I know for some people, when they hear the Chapin boys basketball program being brought up, they roll their eyes, and they're more likely to just turn off and not listen to the rest of this episode. And I think that's part of the problem. So when I started this job, I had zero contacts. I couldn't tell you who were the top boys players, top coaches, top programs, none of that. I was really coming in blind. Yes, I was a sports journalist in El Paso before this, but I covered things really just at the collegiate and pro level. And I very briefly covered high school football for like half a season, 1 year. But I was not embedded or really followed high school basketball here. So I came in with no contacts. And so naturally, I just kind of relied on reading Felix Chavez in the El Paso Times, because there's not a lot of other media outlets or publications. And so, don't have to read much to find out that Chapin is the top program in this area. So one of my first games, I believe the first game I actually went to go cover, was a Chapin boys basketball game. And undeniably, there was this vibe, this energy, this sense that the people in and around the program were very guarded and very protective of their players, and kind of standoffish in a way. Now, me being a journalist who predominantly covered things at the collegiate level and some things at the pro level, athletes, coaches, media relations people connected to those programs or sports teams being standoffish and not being the most friendly to a journalist comes with the territory, which is not a surprise when you consider some of the denigrating coverage of collegiate and pro athletes. I get it. So coming into an environment where it doesn't really seem like I'm welcomed was not something that turned me off, but it was something I made note of for sure. And as I started to cover the team more, as well as other teams in El Paso a lot more, read more things, heard more things, made more contacts, and just kind of heard a lot of other things directly, indirectly, I started to understand why the people that were in and around that program, leading that program, were protective, guarded, and in some instances standoffish. And a lot of it had to do with a lot of negative stereotyping of the people leading the boys basketball program, the players within that program, the parents connected to that program, and just the program writ large. And a lot of accusations about how things are done within that program. And again, these are things that I continuously made note of. But as I started to get a better sense of the program, covered them more, made more contacts in and around the city, not just at Chapin High School, but other schools, AAU coaches, trainers, scouts. What I came to find is that the stereotypes that were being applied to the players and the people in the program and the so-called criticisms of the program weren't really warranted or really rooted or based in any fact, which I found concerning, but I also found relatable, being that I am from Northeast El Paso. I went to Robert E. Lee Elementary, which is now, I believe, Sunrise Mountain Elementary, McGoffin Middle School, and Irvin High School. I've lived in North Hills, Cooperstown, right across the street from Sunrise Park. I went to Park Hills as a kid. I had birthday parties at parks all across Northeast El Paso, slumber parties at friends' houses, trailer parks all around Northeast El Paso. I've been to every nook and cranny in this area. I am deeply embedded on this side of town and very proud to be from the Northeast. But when you're from the Northeast, invariably, directly or indirectly, you hear negative things said about you. And being that I went to McGoffin Middle School and Irvin High School, I heard it pretty consistently from about the age of 10 to my final senior year at Irvin High School. And still to this day, really. You hear a lot of negative sentiments, ideas, stereotypes. For instance, Irvin is where all the dumb kids go. It's a bad school. You're going to get a bad education. Northeast El Paso is dangerous. It's ghetto. Don't go there unless you want to get shot or stabbed. You hear all these things growing up. And what I think people need to understand is when they're voicing these opinions, which they're entitled to, but when they're voicing these opinions and a lot of these negative connotations and stereotypes, even if you think you're just saying it to a friend and not necessarily to somebody from Northeast El Paso, all of that stuff gets back around to the people that live here. And just like the people at the Chapin High School who lead the boys and girls program for that matter. And I think there's something really harmful about that, in that when you have to grow up hearing those negative things said about you, about who you are, your character, the place that you live, that you grow up in, the spaces that you inhabit that are simply not true, you start to internalize those things and you take on those things in ways that you really shouldn't. Now, I come from a very privileged background in that I had two college-educated parents who were teachers who let me know from a very young age that my education and life was not going to stop after high school and that I was going to have to do something with myself. I had people like my parents, my siblings, friends, teachers championing me, uplifting me, supporting me. But not every kid from Northeast El Paso has that, has somebody protecting them. championing them, uplifting them, guarding them from a lot of the negativity that a lot of people from my side of town feel. And I think we need to just collectively as a city recognize that. And this goes for everybody. It's not just people who negatively speak about Northeast El Paso. You know, me as a proud person from Northeast El Paso, I got to be conscious about how I speak about people from the West Side, from Far East El Paso, from downtown, and really consider, am I making generalizations that are based in fact, rooted in real experiences? So it's something that we all have to be considerate of. But somebody that has the perspective of having that full frontal assault placed on you your whole life, and then witnessing that happen to the Chapin boys basketball team, it's something that I think needs to be publicly addressed and stopped in a way where we really consider what we're doing. And I don't really mean this in a condescending way, but it's almost as if we need to return to some basic things that we should have learned in kindergarten. Treat people how you want to be treated. If you do not have something nice to say, don't say it. So if you're in the stands of a basketball game and you think you're just talking to a friend, or you're posting something on one of your social media accounts that only has 12 followers and you don't think people are listening, I promise you, those things that are being said get back to the coaches, the players, and the parents directly or indirectly. And that doesn't even go for the things that people say to these kids, to their face, to these parents, to these coaches, to their face. As I've gotten to know more people in and around the Chapin boys and girls basketball program, there's a recurring sentiment that I've heard more than a few times that I would like to share. And it goes like this. It feels like we get more love when we leave the city than when we're actually in the city. And I find that really disappointing. Now, I think that there are people who hear that and would possibly get immediately defensive and want to refute that and say something like, well, you're taking one or two instances and blowing it out of proportion, or you're exaggerating, you're being dramatic. It's not that bad. You stop talking negatively about the rest of the city. And what I have to say to those people, it's easy to dismiss these experiences and these sentiments that people from Northeast El Paso, or more specifically people within the Chapin basketball program, feel. It's easy to dismiss those things when they're not happening to you and when they're not getting talked about publicly. So it can give you this idea that they're exaggerating, or they're blowing things out of proportion, or they're making things up when it's not happening to you. It can feel like it's not real. But again, as somebody who's lived on this side of town my whole life and knows what that feels like, it's very real. And it's things that you hear that are said about you. But again, it's things that people say to you directly. When a basketball program like the Chapin boys basketball program is and was under Rodney Lewis over the past 6 years, feels like the city that they live in doesn't really appreciate them. I think we have to lend our ear and kind of consider why they feel that way. And there are some pretty valid reasons why they feel that way. But it's more or less just a shame that that's really the case, because another perspective that I want to offer to people is that when I talk to scouts and coaches from outside of El Paso, and we talk about what they know about El Paso, their connection to this city, they talk about the Chapin boys basketball team. They talk about the players on that team, and they talk quite positively. And it gives them the impression that El Paso does have talent. El Paso is worthwhile. El Paso can compete with the schools from Dallas and Houston. And again, going back to this outside perception issue that this is not a talent-rich area that can't compete, Chapin has consistently broken a lot of those stereotypes, and they've represented our city quite well to the rest of Texas and the Southwest region. So, they're doing a lot of positive for basketball in this area. And to be fair and balanced in talking about this, there are definitely plenty of people outside of the Chapin program that champion those kids in that program from other schools, other coaches from other schools, media members like myself. There are people that understand and recognize what Chapin has done specifically in the past 4 years under Rodney Lewis is historic and exceptional and rare, to say the least. So it's not to say that it's a whole city that is against this program or team, but it's a large minority. It's a large contingent of people who I don't think are considerate in the way that they are discussing this program, which leads me into the next point about some of the misinformation about this program and what I think we're missing with not trying to properly observe this program. So when I was in grad school, I took this course called Positive Deviance. Positive Deviance is essentially this observation of social and behavioral cues within a community that is fraught with systemic issues. And within that community, you try to find individuals or smaller groups that are finding and having successful outcomes within a community fraught with systemic issues. So people that are finding and having success in spite of being in an environment that is not conducive to success. And I think Chapin is a really good example of that. Not that basketball in El Paso is systemically bad or poor, but again, there are issues that does not maximize what teams and prospects can do in the city in a more generalized sense. And I think, one, we should be championing everybody's success, especially a team like Chapin, because like I already said, they represent El Paso when they leave El Paso, and they do a very good job of it. But if you don't want to champion Chapin success and, in a sense, support them in that way, at a bare minimum, what the basketball community should and needs to do is observe them, study them, learn from them, and adopt what they're doing. Because what I can promise you, in being responsible for covering 41 programs, there are a lot of things that Chapin does that other programs do not do. And it has nothing to do with the basketball talent that makes them successful. It's other things that are conducive to that success and to having a talented group of players. And I want to talk about a few of those things. Number one, Chapin, at least under Rodney Lewis, because Rodney Lewis stepped down, Tevin Caldwell is now leading the program. I'm very confident that Tevin's going to have a lot of success there, but I can't speak to what the Tevin Caldwell era is going to be, so I'm framing this within what Rodney Lewis did in his 6 years. Under Rodney Lewis, there was no program that better promoted their players than Rodney Lewis and his staff. In terms of publishing and promoting their players, bar none, they did better than any other program that I've seen. Now, promoting and publicizing your players is not the most important thing to leading a program and developing players. I will admit that. It is important, not the most important, but it does matter, especially when it comes to a region, an area like the borderland that doesn't have a lot of exposure. So when you're in a landscape like El Paso that does not have a huge media landscape, and you don't have a lot of people coming into the city, media, scouts, coaches, we have to be reliant on ourselves to publicize and promote our players. And sadly, what I found is that a considerable amount of programs do not promote or publicize their players at a bare minimum, let alone do a good job of it. It's a handful of programs that I would say do a good job at that. But again, under Rodney Lewis and his coaching staff and the people who did those things, they were simply the best. They did better than anybody else. It matters. When I'm talking to scouts from outside of El Paso and we're talking back and forth about players, I can't mention how many times where it's like, yeah, this point guard is phenomenal. I mean, he's an amazing three-point shooter, one of the best three-point shooters in the borderland, bar none. This kid has college range, can do it all from beyond the arc. And they would ask, oh man, sounds awesome. What's his three-point shooting percentage? And I have to say, well, I don't know. The coach doesn't post their stats. So I'm just kind of going off eye test. And the conversations end really quickly there. And then when scouts talk to coaches, those conversations fizzle out really quickly too. So again, these aren't the most important things, but at a bare minimum, posting up-to-date rosters, posting statistics, getting on social media and talking about what your team did game from game, those things are important. And Chapin did those things and did those things very, very well during the Rodney Lewis era. And I think they'll continue to do that well. Another thing that I think is really unique about the program is that in the Rodney Lewis era, the parents allowed the coaches to do the coaching. The parents allowed the coaches to do the coaching. There are other good programs in El Paso in the borderline region where that is also true, but it's not pervasive within this city, within this area. And every day I hear stories about the politics and the power dynamics between parents, coaches, school administrators, ADs, and how it ultimately and largely never benefits the kids. At Chapin High School, the parents let the coaches do the coaching. So important. I cannot stress how important that is and how undervalued that is and why that needs to be recognized. And I promise you, as somebody who's responsible for having to cover 41 programs, and I will admit, I'm not as well versed in all 41 programs, but I know a lot of them pretty well at this point, have contacts at most at this point, hear a lot of stories. And parents letting the coaches coach is not common at every program. At Chapin, at least under Rodney Lewis, that was the case. So that's the second thing. Third, they have a deeply embedded culture that commands their kids to put in the time and the effort to being developed. Furthermore, and more specifically, no player on those teams are entitled to anything. Playing time, shots, recognition of any sort. They have to earn all of those things. What you come to find at Chapin is that in a player's final 2 years there is when they really start to get a lot of big opportunities as juniors or maybe even as seniors. And you have players who are willing to pay their dues to come up through the junior varsity program, to come off the bench for 1, 2, 3, 4 years, and they still reap the benefits of it. Let me give an example. Messiah Wilson, who's a 2025 prospect for Chapin, he's a senior guard, just got his first college offer. Messiah Wilson, who's entering his senior year, has never been a starter for Chapin. And at least to my knowledge, is not going to be starting as a senior for Chapin this year. And he has a college offer. What do you think that says about the culture that they have and how they develop players and how they move players through the ranks? You can't say that about a lot of other programs. I can't tell you how many stories I hear about, well, this kid transferred here, this kid transferred there because he wasn't getting enough playing time, or he didn't like the coach, or the mom and dad didn't like the coach, or the mom and dad had a disagreement with the AD about this and that, and the kid wanted to start, but he wasn't starting. There's none of that at Chapin High School. That's very unique. Again, there's other programs where you have a good fostered culture like that. I think more on the girl side, to be honest, but it is very rare that you do have that. And the last kind of thing that I want to talk about with Chapin High School is to dispel some misinformation. I think chief among that misinformation is that Chapin illegally recruits kids from outside of their district and is stealing talent from all around the city. Now, again, I want to provide the most balanced perspective and coverage of this that I can give. Does Chapin have kids within their program and has had kids within their program who do not live in that district? Absolutely. Absolutely. But another thing I want to offer within this perspective, you will not find an athletic program across any sport, football, basketball, volleyball, tennis, track and field, soccer, that has 100% of a varsity, junior varsity, and freshman roster full of kids who live within those districts. Every school, every sport, every program has kids in those programs who do not live in the districts of the schools and the teams that they're playing for. This is everywhere. This is not just Chapin who has kids from outside of their district. It's every school, every program, every single sport. So if we're going to be critical of that fact, we need to be consistent in applying that criticism to every school, every sport, and every program. And if we're not, then we should not lead criticism that is highly hypocritical. We shouldn't. Deeper within that, why I think that criticism is really tone deaf in a lot of ways. I really have a hard time understanding how people can criticize the autonomous choices that parents and their kids make to find the best opportunities for them to succeed educationally, academically, but also in terms of a developmental aspect but also from a sporting perspective. I don't understand how we could really criticize people who are trying to make the best investments for their kids. And with everything that I just said that Chapin does, that is very unique to that program, that not a lot of other programs do, how could you blame any kid or parent for wanting their child to go play for that program? I want to give an example. 2024 prospect named Mudiay Gaboa. He was a senior for the Huskies last year, and Mudiay was a transfer from Burgess High School. So Burgess, although has a pretty strong history of boys basketball and is going to be excellent, I think, this year in girls basketball, at least on the boys side, is a bit of influx. It's a program in transition. They're not as strong as they were about a half decade ago. So they're kind of a program that's in transitioning, but I also do think the boys team is going to be better and more competitive than they were last year. But the point being, Gaboa and his family kind of understanding that decided that his best opportunity going forward, if you wanted to play college basketball, would be at a Chapin High School. Mudiay Gaboa is now playing college basketball. And I'm not saying that wouldn't have been possible at Burgess last year. I think it would have been a lot more difficult, if I'm being completely honest. So knowing that, why are we being so hypercritical? Truly, what's the real issue here? If we're keeping the main thing, which is the potential and future success of these kids, why are we being hypercritical of that, especially if we can acknowledge that Chapin as a program does more than a lot of other programs for their kids and does those things a lot better than a lot of other programs? I'm not sure how we can genuinely be critical of that in a very fair and honest way. It just doesn't make sense to me, especially as adults, when a lot of us commute to work all the time and look for better opportunities all the time. We don't have a problem doing that, but parents and their kids can't do that. And again, it's not as if Chapin is the only program that has kids living outside of their district. Every other program does it. So it's happening all over this city. And yet we tend to only be hypercritical of one program doing it. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't seem very justified, in my opinion. But again, to the part that I think is not very well informed, they're not stealing kids away from other programs. Again, these are autonomous choices made by parents and the kids to make these moves to go to this program. This is not college sports. There's no NIL money. There's no salary cap. This isn't the pros. They're not handing over money to any of these kids. They're making these choices to come to Chapin to do so. And man, can you blame them? They've won more than any other school in the past half decade. They've gone further within the playoffs than any other school in the past half decade. They've put more kids in college programs than any other school in the past half decade. So going back to the very first thing that I talked about, this generally agreed upon opinion that there are too many schools here, and with the acknowledgement that we do not have enough supply to meet the demands of filling these schools with program leaders. So what we're basically telling kids is it's basically the luck of the draw. And if you end up at a school with a program that is nascent and doesn't have a program leader that really cares or knows what they're doing, and you have talent and potential, you're just going to have to write it out for 4 years because that's where you live, when it's perfectly fine and legal to transfer and play with outside of your district if you do it within the means. What are we saying? Again, I played at Irvin High School for my father. I was supposed to go to Andrews High School. And again, I was a decently talented kid. I could have played college tennis at the D2 level if I chose that path. I ultimately decided not to. That would have been a lot harder if I went to Andrews High School, because the coach and the program leader at that time, again, not well qualified, but more importantly, did not care and did not put in a lot of effort with his kids. So I'm supposed to pay for that because I'm supposed to go to this school because I live in this district? I don't see the fairness of that. So I don't think we should be criticizing a school like Chapin. So ultimately, I think the lesson that needs to be learned here is that we need to champion other people's success here in this city, and not look at other people succeeding and winning and doing it in very positive ways that have more to do with just talent than to just criticize it. Observe it, study it, learn from it, adopt from it, which leads me to my second to last point today. We need to empower people with the most amount of knowledge on how to train, develop, and nurture the talent in this area. I don't think this is an issue that is going completely unrecognized, but again, when I talk to people, everybody kind of has this sense that when it comes to basketball decisions in this city, there tends to be a lot of people with hands in the pot trying to have some type of power and make some type of choices around what teams should be made up within high school or AAU, city league, summer league teams, where players should go, how players should train and develop. It's a lot of different voices, a lot of different people, a lot of different opinions trying to have sway and power over those things. And again, I think it's a lot of well-intentioned people. I don't think it's a cesspool of bad people trying to do bad things, making bad choices. I think it's a lot of well-intentioned people, but within that, and I want to be very careful in the way that I say this, but I haven't found another way to say this, but being a parent does not automatically qualify you to make decisions around basketball development and coaching. It just doesn't. The things that qualifies people to make basketball related decisions are the qualifications that that person has in basketball. It should be decided on your tenure, your resume, your CV within the actual sport. Did you play the sport? Do you have a history of coaching the sport? To what level did you play the sport? And here's where I think this is probably the most solvable issue, in that there are a lot of really knowledgeable people within the borderland who have played basketball either professionally or at the D1 level, who know what they're talking about, who know what they're doing, who I think to some degree have some sway and influence and power. And it's not really about power in the sense of being authoritative, but power in the sense of we need to listen to these people. We need to empower their voices. We need to amplify their voices, because although it's a lot of different hands in the pot, all of the goals are the same, in that we want the best for these kids in terms of their nurturing, development, and their opportunities at the next level. So we're all in agreement on that, but we're just not agreeing on how to do that, which is why I think more hands have to come out, and we have to listen to the people who are most qualified to do those things. I'm going to bring up a few names, and I'm not really bringing them up as endorsements. I'm not in business with any of these people. I know some of these people not tremendously well. I'm not telling you to give your business to these people. You got to do your own vetting, and you have to do kind of your own determinations. But I'm bringing some of these people up in specific because I think they're good examples of people who are qualified, educated, and have experience of playing and coaching and training at the highest level, and have a track record with a lot of our prospects here. And if there's names that I don't mention, I promise you it's not because I'm choosing not to mention. It's probably because I haven't heard of them yet. I don't know them yet. I would love to get to know them. Again, I'm trying to grow my contact list every day, and I do not turn down an opportunity to talk to somebody who is well versed within the sport, who knows what they're talking about. If anything, it's the struggle is getting people who will give me the time of day. It's not me rejecting people to talk to. So I want to be clear on that. First person, or first two people I want to mention are Alexis Thornton and Genzel Nash at Different Breed Training in East El Paso. Alexis Thornton and Genzel Nash are former Division One basketball players. Alexis Thornton is from El Paso, and I believe played at Montwood High School in the late 2000s. Genzel Nash played at UTEP in the mid 2010s. I actually covered Genzel when she was in college, and no hyperbole, Genzel was part of some of the best teams in program history, along with Kayla Thornton. They played together, and Genzel Nash was a nationally recruited high school prospect who was one of the best scorers in the state of Texas, in addition to in college being one of the best scorers in Conference USA, and honestly one of the best ISO scorers that I got to cover in my 4.5 years of covering women's college basketball. Legitimate top D1 player. That's what Nash was. And they do skills-based training out in East El Paso, have some of the top prospects that train with them. Again, not telling you have to give them your business. Not telling you to go to them over somebody else, but again, I'm just giving an example of two women, college educated, played D1 college basketball, excelled at that, and have a client list of top talent in this area. These are the type of voices and people that we need to be listening to and empowering on how to train and develop kids in this area. Another one, Paris Wall. Paris Wall runs House for Athlete. He's a certified strength and conditioning specialist, college educated, former D1 basketball player, has a treasure trove of top basketball players training with him. I was at his facility about a month ago or close to a month ago. D1 coaches come out of that facility every single week, knowing what he's doing with a lot of those athletes. Again, not saying you have to give him your business, not saying you have to go to him over somebody else. Just another example of somebody who educated, qualified, highly intelligent, played at the D1 level, who has a track record of training and developing some of the best prospects that we have. I've heard a lot about Chris Bryant, who's another strength and conditioning specialist. I believe he's out in Northeast El Paso. I've heard about him from multiple people and from people within that space of strength and conditioning who said he does a great job. Jason Williams, who is a private trainer, I still believe, I think he's trying to get into high school coaching now. But Jason Williams, former D1 basketball player, former pro player who played at UTEP in the mid 2000s, one of the best players to come out of the men's program in the 21st century, one of the best all-around players from this century over the last 25 years, undoubtedly. Again, people that are well qualified, play at the highest level, train some of the best players, have a track record. So whether it's Alexis Thornton and Zenzel Nash and Paris Wall and Chris Bryant and Jason Williams and so on and so forth, whoever it is who you might want to give your business to or not, these are the people who need to be empowered. These are the people who need to be listened to when it comes to developing prospects, because they actually did it. They know what they're talking about. And again, I'm going to say it one final time, and I do not mean to condescend. Being a parent does not qualify you to train and develop and coach. The qualifications needed are experience, education, and a background in training, developing, and coaching. And if you don't have that, you should listen to the people who've done it, because they're really good at it. And I don't think enough people in this area do. I think there are some people, parents, who take these matters into their own hands when they're not the most qualified people to do it. That's not all parents. I'm not trying to generalize a whole city of parents. I know a large part of my listenership is parents, but that's who it tends to be. But again, it's not all parents. I mean, for example, the Falk Ramirez's. So Irene Falk Ramirez, the girls basketball head coach at Eastwood, her husband, Joey Ramirez, a former D2 college basketball player. Their two boys are Devin Falk Ramirez, one of the best players in this area, one of the top prospects in 2025, a D1 talent, and Julian Falk Ramirez, one of the top 2027 prospects. They clearly know what they're doing with their kids. But with that, those two people, one is one of the best coaches in the borderland in Irene Falk Ramirez, and the father played college basketball, but also their kids train with some of the people that I mentioned previously. So they don't even take it upon themselves to do it all by themselves. But again, they actually have a background and a resume in basketball, and they don't leave it all to themselves. So again, it's not all parents. I'm not trying to generalize or admonish or denigrate in that way, but I think I've had too many conversations and heard these things too many times to not speak about these things very plainly. Okay, so that's point number 3. We have to empower the people with the most amount of knowledge and experience. Last point, and this is very specific and just my observations that I've made in really like the last 3 months, and this is really my own opinion, not that other people wouldn't agree with it, but this is really coming from me. Again, getting back to this idea of positive deviance, looking at smaller groups or individuals who are having successful outcomes within a community that is fraught with issues. I really feel like we're not giving enough support to girls basketball in El Paso. And within that, I think that girls basketball in this area, similar to like the Chapin boys basketball program, needs to be observed, studied, learned from, and adopted from, because the culture of girls basketball compared to the culture of boys basketball in El Paso is different. And there are, I think, a lot of smart and positive things within girls basketball that I think should be adopted in boys basketball. Now, I'm really not trying to compare and contrast boys and girls basketball in this area, because I think there are a lot of good boys basketball programs. There are a lot of really talented prospects and high character kids in boys basketball. And there's a lot of positive things going on in boys basketball. So I want to be clear on that. However, broadly speaking, looking at the whole landscape of boys basketball in the borderland, looking at the whole landscape of girls basketball in the borderland, undeniably, there are cultural things that are going on in girls basketball that I think need to be looked at and adopted. Chief among them, outside of high school basketball and high school play, there's a significant difference in the amount of teams that play AAU circuit ball. There's so many different ways that you can frame it, essentially, from circuit teams to city teams, summer teams, whatever you want to frame it, contextualize it as. And to be clear, what I mean is there's a lot less teams on the girl side and an abundance of teams on the boys side. So many so that I can't count, and I've ceased to try to keep count of, because it's so proliferated to an extent that I don't think it needs to be. And I think it's in some ways fostered a certain subset of boys basketball culture that is too specific and relied upon the individual choices and supposed needs of certain basketball prospects. My son doesn't like playing on this AAU team. Well, I'm going to take him off this team and put him on this city league team that doesn't really play against good competition. My son isn't getting playing time for this AAU coach, so I'm going to go start my own team. You don't really see that on the girls' side. And so how that impacts and connects back to the high school teams is this. I was at the Girls Jamboree Showcase a month ago, and within the first 5 minutes of watching the Eastwood girls basketball team, in the first 5 minutes of watching Americas, Franklin, and the Chapin girls basketball team, it became very clear that I was witnessing and watching something from a team chemistry perspective, from a player development perspective, from a player character perspective, that is far and away different and more cohesive than what I watched for a year and a half on a weekly basis in boys high school basketball, and even at the boys jamboree. And I was honestly shocked by it and kind of amazed by it, how obvious the positive team culture is in some of these programs. And again, chief among them, Eastwood girls basketball. I was so impressed by what I saw. And really the only other program that I thought about when I was watching the Eastwood girls play was the Chapin boys basketball team. Now, it's not to say that there aren't other boys programs that have good team culture, but there's a difference when the team culture is being fostered and controlled and impacted directly from the players, kind of like a bottom-up approach instead of a top-down approach where it's really about what the coach is doing. And it's not to say, obviously, Rodney Lewis and his coaching staff had a lot to say in how that culture was fostered. Then Falk Ramirez at Eastwood has a lot to say in how that team culture is fostered. But I talked to Coach Falk Ramirez very humbly. She talked about how those girls make her look better as a coach than she actually is. Now, I kind of disagree with that. I think she's an excellent coach. But the point being, there is accountability and a really positive, empowering culture within a lot of these girls' programs that is not the case within the boys' programs. And a big reason for that is a lot of these girls, when it gets to outside of high school season, play on the same AAU teams with and against each other, travel together, play against top competition in ways that is not happening in boys basketball. So you can go watch a Eastwood girls basketball play or Medicus play, and it's like watching 5 of the same players because they have years and years of playing together with and against top competition in the city and outside of the city. That pays dividends. That's so important. And that's something that is a lot more pervasive in girls basketball within the borderland than it is in boys basketball. And I think, again, observe it, study it, learn from it, adopt from it. There's a lot that's right within girls high school basketball in this area. That's not necessarily going on within boys high school basketball. I was talking with a coach, a program leader. I'm not going to say who, not necessarily connected to a high school. And we're talking about prospects on the boys and girls side. And he asked me a question and he said, Javi, in this last hour that we've talked, how many girls that have we talked about where I said it's two-way effort and engagement, never giving up on a play, no negative body language, none of that? How many girls prospects have we talked about that I've said that about? And I said, well, basically every single one that you mentioned. And then he asked me, how many boys did I say that about? And I said, I mean, a fair amount, but certainly not all of them. That comes back to the culture of the sport across the different genders that needs to be paid attention to. But to the last point, putting that aside of just observing and adopting what's going on in girls basketball, it needs better support. Undoubtedly, it needs better support. And it needs equal support to what we give to boys basketball in this area. I'm not talking about giving it more support. It needs equal support because it should have equal support. This isn't about what side has more talent or what side do we find more entertaining to watch. You can have whatever opinions you want about that. But in terms of how we support boys and girls basketball, it should be equal. And the example I want to give is the Jamboree Showcase put on by Bob Jones and some of the people at West Texas Blazers. The Jamboree Showcase happened on back-to-back weekends. The girls' showcase was first. Boys' showcase was second. The girls' showcase was unfortunately held at a venue that I don't think was an appropriate stage for the consolidation of talent that coalesced at that showcase. I would say about 90 to 95% of the top prospects within the borderline area was in attendance for that showcase on the girls' side, from El Paso, Las Cruces, Hobbs, Alamogordo, with the exception of a few teams missing and a few top players, but basically everybody was there. And unfortunately, I just don't think the venue was appropriate. I'm not going to get into the specifics of what I've been told about why that happened necessarily or who that happened with, but essentially, the girls' showcase ended up being in that venue because the showcase runners got priced out of the intended venue that they wanted it at. And I just find that terribly unfortunate when politics, red tape, dollars and cents gets in the way of supporting kids within our community. Because the thing is, there's always going to be an argument for why you can say no to something from a political perspective, from a dollars and cents perspective, from a red tape perspective. You can always say no because of those things. But again, it gets back to this individualistic mentality that we have in this city about basketball, where if it doesn't work for me, my team, my kid, my player, my program, my facility, I'm going to say no, because doing something that is good for the collective, if it doesn't fully benefit me, is not worth it for some people. And I have to say, and this isn't even about basketball, because I have experience with trying to procure facilities to use to coach and to run programs. The stinginess that school administrators have with opening their facilities, and being that it's public school facilities that were created, funded, and sustained with taxpayer dollars, is astounding to me. Again, these are public school administrators with facilities that were created, funded, and are sustained through taxpayer dollars. And they will continuously find ways to say no because of the supposed risk that comes along with opening these facilities. I'm not ignorant to the fact that turning on the lights at facilities costs money. I know. I get it. But again, it's this individualistic mentality that makes people feel justified in saying no when they can do things to support a broader community of kids, that I find really disheartening. And hopefully that changes. Another thing about the showcase, and this will be the last point on this issue, and this is more of a challenge to those within the boys basketball community. Part of the reason why the boys Jamboree Showcase was a bigger event than the girls outside of the venues was that the boys showcase had more people helping put it on. It had more volunteers. And some of the volunteers at the boys Jamboree Showcase were actually some of the top girls prospects in the borderland. And my challenge to those within the boys basketball community, some of the boys prospects, their parents, my challenge is to return the favor next year when the Jamboree Showcase comes back around. If you're a boys basketball prospect listening to this episode, if you're a parent of any of the boys prospects, volunteer your kids, just like those girls volunteered their time to help put on the boys. Because let me tell you a little bit about what those girls did. They took box scores, they recorded games, they posted on social media. They did things to publicize, promote, and keep the media vehicle side of that showcase running. And for somebody like me, independent of the showcase, who covered it, they made my job and my coverage a lot easier, because I can't watch 2 games at a time, but I could reliably get stats from them, find out how games went, talk about players. So that's my challenge, is to go return the favor to the girls next year. Volunteer your weekend to go do box scores, to go record games, to help post on social media. Return the favor for them, not because they deserve more than you, but because they deserve the same amount as you. So if they can sacrifice a day, 4 hours, a weekend to help you out, to put you on, I don't see a reason why that can't be done for them. Because again, it's not about getting more. They deserve an equal amount of effort and support from our community as the boys do. And we need to be a lot more aware of that, because boys basketball gets a lot more support for reasons outside of talent or entertainment value. And by a lot of women and young girls, prospects, who are helping support for free. So that's my challenge. Go return the favor. Go put on for the top girls. Let's equal out this support within our community. And if I could just wrap up with one final comment, It's really, however these issues get solved, it's about working together as a community and not as a large group of individuals to accomplish changing and solving these issues, because that's really the root of it internally, is that we don't really work together as a collective in again, the things that we vote for, consume, support, the people that we champion, the voices that we empower or don't empower, the other gender of prospects that we don't give equal support to. We need to change that. We need to work together collectively as a city, because those outside perceptions, those external issues aren't going to change if we keep this individualistic mentality of just looking out for my kid, my player, my team, my program, my school. If we keep doing that, then we're going to keep the same numbers, the same results of one D1 prospect on the boys' side, one D1 prospect on the girls' side. That won't change going forward. And it's not really about pumping up the numbers at the D1 level. I strongly believe it's about getting in where you fit in. And for some kids, the best route that they're going to take is going to a JUCO, going to a D2, going to a NAIA. But again, if we can all agree that one D1 prospect on both sides is not representative, we have to look at ourselves and see how we're perpetuating that issue. And it's because we're not working together as a collective. We're working all as individuals on developing, training, coaching, nurturing talent in this area. So that's going to do it for today's episode. If you stuck around for this long, I thank you. This is definitely the longest episode I've done, probably the least entertaining, but I think it was really important. But hopefully going forward, this is a one and done. And we're going to get back to regular scheduled programming after this. The next episode hopefully is going to be a preview of the UTEP women's and men's basketball season for the upcoming 2024-2025 basketball seasons with Zay Galindo, also known as UTEP Zay online. And then after that, I'm going to be getting into team previews for boys and girls high school basketball in the borderline area. So back to regular programming as it's intended to be. And again, if you've supported this podcast, I can't thank you enough. Liking, subscribing, sharing, commenting only helps grow the podcast. The more this grows, the more opportunities can come with this. So thank you again. That is The Land. I am Javier Cortez. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you next time.